The locked room. The old hotel stood at the edge of the city, forgotten by most, as if time itself had decided it was no longer worthy of attention. Its name had long since faded from the sign outside, an old, rusty plaque barely hanging on by a single screw. For years, the building had been the kind of place people avoided, whispers trailing behind it like an ominous cloud. It wasn't the sort of place one would choose to stay unless there were no other options. But Mark had no other choice. He had been traveling for weeks, searching for something, he wasn't sure what, and the budget hotels had slowly dwindled to nothing. The other places he'd checked were either too far out of his reach or had closed down without a trace. This hotel, though, well, it wasn't ideal. The walls were peeling, the carpet threadbare, and the smell of mildew lingered in the air like a bad memory. But the man behind the counter, who spoke in a low voice and rarely met Mark's eyes, had offered him a room at an unbelievable price. Just 1 month, the man said, his fingers lightly tapping on the counter. Nobody stays longer than that. It's bad luck, you know. Mark had been too tired to question him. He just nodded, handed over the cash, and made his way up to the room. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, with old portraits hanging crookedly along the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow him, and for a brief moment, he felt an unsettling shiver run down his spine. He shook it off. After all, what was there to fear? It was just a hotel, just a room. When he entered, the room was colder than he expected. The window was slightly cracked, and the wind held through the gaps. The bed, covered with an ancient quilt, was pushed against the far wall. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. But what stood out most was the door on the opposite side of the room. A door that looked like it led to nowhere. It was strange. There was no visible handle, just a keyhole. But when Mark went to check, the door was locked from the inside. He chuckled nervously. Maybe it was just an old storage closet, something left behind from a previous time. Still, the absence of a handle bothered him. As he unpacked his few belongings, the eerie quiet of the place began to weigh on him. He tried to distract himself by flicking through the TV channels, mostly static or old reruns. The place felt like a time capsule, preserving the past in some strange, unsettling way. The kind of place where things didn't just exist, they lingered. He caught himself glancing toward the door on the far side of the room, wondering what was behind it. The first night passed in a haze of exhaustion. But something felt off. The next morning, he found himself staring at the door again. He didn't even know why. There was nothing special about it. But the longer he stared, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His breath caught in his throat as he noticed something strange, a faint shadow behind the door. It seemed to flicker in the corner of his vision, like a figure trying to get out. He rubbed his eyes. Sleep deprivation. That was all it was. Or was it? The next few days blurred together. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The staff at the hotel were distant, and whenever he asked about the locked door, they grew oddly silent. One evening, an older woman who worked in the lobby leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't go near it," she said, her eyes wide with some unspoken fear. "There are things in that room. People disappear." Mark wasn't sure what to make of her words. Disappear? But people didn't just disappear. There had to be some logical explanation for the strange things he had been sensing. The next morning, he decided to confront the door. He approached it cautiously, hand resting on the old wooden frame. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the walls. His pulse quickened. It was as though the room itself was alive, watching him. Mark shook his head, telling himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He turned the handle of the locked door, and to his surprise, it gave way. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Mark hesitated. He should have just walked away, but something compelled him to step inside. The air felt colder here, like the very walls were exhaling their breath onto him. He reached for the light switch, no power. Of course. The whole place felt like it had been stuck in time. He used the faint light coming in through the crack in the window to guide his way, feeling around the walls for anything that could give him a clue. His hand brushed something cold, metallic. It was a key. A key that didn't belong to any lock he had seen before. Curiosity gnawed at him. Where could it possibly lead? Was there more to this room than he'd realized? Something told him he was about to uncover something dangerous. But the moment he turned around, he froze. The door had closed behind him. Slowly. As if it had a mind of its own. Mark's heart raced as he tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in. His mind raced, thoughts colliding in chaotic bursts. There was something in here with him. Something that didn't want him to leave. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room shifted. They seemed to swirl, coiling around him like a thick fog. He could hear faint whispers, so soft at first, like the breeze outside. Then louder, clearer, as if the very walls were speaking to him. They warned him of the room, of the curse that plagued the hotel. 1 month, the whispers repeated. 1 month is all you have. The temperature dropped. He could see his breath now, curling in the air like smoke. The shadows pressed closer, tighter, until he could feel them brush against his skin. They seemed to grow darker, heavier, suffocating him. There was no escape. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went quiet. Mark stood in the center of the room, the key still clenched in his hand. The door had vanished. The room had no corners, no walls, it stretched on forever, an endless void that swallowed him whole. But just before the darkness took him, a single thought pierced through the fog in his mind. What if this place was never meant for anyone to leave? Mark woke with a jolt, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The room around him was unchanged, the dim light from the window barely pushing through the curtains. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the lingering effects of the nightmare, or was it, still twisting his thoughts? He was in his room again. The same bed, the same peeling wallpaper. But something was off. The air felt thick, charged, like the atmosphere had shifted in subtle ways he couldn't put into words. He sat up slowly, his mind still racing from the unsettling sensation of being trapped in that endless, shadowed room. The locked door. The whispers. The key. His hand instinctively reached for the drawer beside his bed, pulling it open with trembling fingers. Inside was the same key he had found in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. It was real. It had to be. He stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, and moved toward the far side of the room. The door, his only way out, still had no handle. The keyhole stared at him, mocking him with its promise of answers. But Mark hesitated. What had happened? Was it a dream? Was he still dreaming? But something deep within him told him he couldn't afford to wait any longer. The room, this hotel, whatever it was, had a strange grip on him. It was pulling him in, tightening around him like a noose. He turned the key, the sound of the lock clicking as it gave way to his touch. The door swung open with a groan that echoed in the silence, revealing nothing but a long, dark hallway stretching out before him. Mark stepped into the corridor, the light from his room fading behind him. The air here was colder, heavier. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than the last, the walls pressing in closer as if they too were watching him. He glanced down at his feet. The floor was worn, uneven, like something had walked here for years and years, but no one had ever bothered to clean up the mess. He moved cautiously, his fingers brushing the walls as he walked. The flickering bulbs above did little to illuminate the darkness that swallowed the hallway, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too far. He reached the end of the hall and found another door, this one locked too. A chill ran down his spine as he tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Please, not this," he whispered, a wave of frustration surging through him. "Just, let me out." But there was no answer. Only the quiet hum of the hotel, the sound of silence, pressing in on him. Something faint, caught his eye. At the far end of the hallway, beyond the locked door, was a window. Just a sliver of daylight cutting through the gloom. He hurried toward it, hoping it would offer some kind of escape, some shred of reality. He pushed open the window with one hand, his body bracing against the cold as he peered out. And that's when he saw it. The street outside wasn't the street he had walked on when he first arrived. It was a dark, foggy alley that seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into an impossible distance. The buildings across from him weren't the ones he remembered either. Somehow, they looked older, worn, as if they had existed long before he had even set foot in this city. The world outside the window felt wrong. Like a place out of time, a place that couldn't possibly exist. He stepped back, his hand trembling as he let the window fall shut. The hallway seemed to pulse around him, the walls shifting like they were alive. He could hear faint whispers again, only this time, they weren't just voices, they were laughter, mocking him, taunting him for his confusion. It felt as though the hotel itself was taking pleasure in his discomfort. The shadows grew thicker, pressing in, until they were almost suffocating. And then, as if out of nowhere, a door at the end of the hallway opened. It creaked softly, and Mark found himself staring at it, unable to look away. For a moment, he wondered if it was a trap. But something pulled him toward it, something deeper than his fear, compelling him to move forward. It felt like a choice. But it wasn't. Mark entered the room without thinking, stepping over the threshold into another dimension. The space was vast, and yet, it was empty. The walls were bare, and the floor was cold. In the center of the room was a small, wooden table with a single object resting on it. A book. Mark's eyes widened as he approached it. The cover was old, leather-bound, but with no title, no indication of what it might be. He reached for it, and as his fingers brushed the edges, a sudden, searing pain shot through his hand. He pulled back, staring at his palm, but there was nothing, no wound, no mark, just the lingering sensation of something unseen, something unnatural. His breath quickened. Something wasn't right. The book. The room. The whole hotel. They were all part of something larger. Something he couldn't explain. And he was in the middle of it, trapped in its web, unable to break free. The door behind him slammed shut. He spun around, heart pounding, and realized that he wasn't alone. The shadows had taken form. They were human shapes, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through his very soul. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching him. Mark's legs shook, and he found himself unable to speak. What were they? Why were they here? The room seemed to shrink around him, the figures drawing closer, their silent presence suffocating him. He felt his throat tighten, his body growing colder, as though the very air was being sucked from the room. But then, one of the figures spoke. 1 month, it whispered, its voice hollow and distant. 1 month is all you have. The words echoed in Mark's mind, but they didn't make sense. What did they mean? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door open again, and Mark was thrown backward. He landed hard against the floor, gasping for air. The room, the shadows, the whispers, all of it faded into nothingness. He was back in his room. But this time, the door was wide open. The hallway outside seemed brighter, somehow more alive. The strange figures were gone. The room was empty. Had it all been a hallucination? Or was it just the beginning? Mark stood at the threshold, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. He glanced down at the key in his hand, then at the door behind him. His mind raced, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. There was only one thing he knew for sure. Time was running out. Mark stood at the doorway, staring into the hallway, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. The silence of the hotel pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. He glanced back over his shoulder at the room he had just left. The room that had somehow shifted, changed in ways he couldn't comprehend. His heart hammered in his chest as he considered his options. He could leave, just walk away, go down the stairs, out the front door, and never look back. But the feeling, the nagging pull deep within his gut, told him that wasn't the right choice. Something about this place, it wasn't finished with him yet. He wasn't finished with it. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder now, as if the building itself was breathing in time with him, each step a slow, deliberate movement toward an inevitable fate. The hall stretched out before him, the dim light flickering overhead like a dying flame. The shadows shifted as if alive, reaching for him with invisible hands, but he pushed forward. He had no idea what he was looking for: answers, escape, a way to survive, but he couldn't stop now. The locked door behind him had already drawn him in too far, too deep. Whatever it was, the hotel had become a part of him. And that thought terrified him more than anything. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should, the walls growing narrower, closing in on him. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. He quickened his pace, moving past the doors, not daring to stop at any of them. The door with the locked keyhole flashed in his mind, the one that had started this whole thing, the door that led to the strange room, the one that he couldn't understand. He had to get back to it. He had to know what lay behind it. When he reached it, he found that the door was open, no, wide open, as though it had been waiting for him. He stepped inside without thinking, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was exactly as it had been before, cold, empty, suffocating. But there was something different about it now. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, and the air vibrated with a strange energy. At the center of the room sat a chair. A wooden chair, simple and unassuming, yet somehow out of place. Mark felt a pull toward it, as though something were urging him to sit. His legs moved on their own accord, carrying him closer until he was standing in front of the chair. He hesitated. "What's the point?" he muttered to himself. "What could it hurt?" He sat down. As soon as his body made contact with the chair, a sharp pain shot through his back, causing him to gasp. His fingers gripped the arms of the chair, but they seemed to sink into the wood, as though it were absorbing him, pulling him deeper into its hold. The pain intensified, searing through his spine, and suddenly, the room around him dissolved. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt as though he were falling, plunging into darkness, unable to see, to breathe, to move. But then, just as abruptly as the sensation had begun, it stopped. The pain ceased, and the world around him snapped back into focus. He was no longer in the room. He was somewhere else entirely. The space around him was vast, impossibly so. The walls were gone, replaced by an infinite stretch of nothingness. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to understand something, something he wasn't yet ready to grasp. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the void. 1 month, it said, the same words he had heard before, whispered on the edge of his consciousness. 1 month is all you have. Mark's body tensed, his skin prickling. He recognized the voice. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was something real. Something alive. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound escaped. The silence pressed down on him, drowning out his thoughts. He felt the pull again, stronger this time, as though the air itself were tugging at him, pulling him in a direction he couldn't see. But he had no choice. His legs moved on their own, and he began to walk, each step taking him deeper into the nothingness. The void seemed endless, stretching in every direction. But eventually, in the distance, something appeared. A faint, flickering light. He hurried toward it, the sensation of time slipping away as he moved. The closer he got, the more the light became defined, taking shape. It was the hotel. But not the one he knew. This hotel was different. It was grand, opulent, impossibly so. The doors were made of polished wood, the chandeliers above sparkling with an ethereal glow. The air smelled faintly of roses and decay, as though beauty and rot were locked in some twisted embrace. Mark stepped forward, his feet moving of their own accord, and the doors opened before him. Inside, the lobby was unlike anything he had ever seen. The floors were covered in gold and marble, and the walls stretched impossibly high, adorned with tapestries that seemed to shimmer with movement. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something wrong about it, something that made Mark's stomach turn. At the center of the room stood a man. He was tall, wearing a dark suit that seemed to blend into the shadows. His face was obscured by a mask. No, not a mask. It was his face, a face that was barely human, an unnerving blend of features that didn't belong together. His eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly, watching Mark with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You've come," the figure said, his voice deep and hollow, reverberating through the vast room. "You've finally come to understand." Mark's heart raced. "What is this place? Why am I here?" The figure tilted his head, as if considering the question. "You've always been here," he replied. "This hotel has been waiting for you. It has been waiting for all of you." The room seemed to tilt, the ground beneath Mark's feet shifting like it was alive. The shadows pressed closer, the walls stretching, contracting, as if the entire space were breathing. He wanted to scream, to run, but the pull was too strong. He had no choice but to listen, to hear the answer he didn't want to know. 1 month, the figure repeated, his voice a low, haunting whisper. "You have 1 month to uncover the truth. But the truth is a curse. A truth you can never escape." Mark's vision blurred again, his body trembling. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to get out of this nightmare, but there was no escape. The room was everywhere, the hotel, the voices, his fate was sealed, and there was no going back. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the whisper. 1 month, and then you are mine.